Many scholars begin their discussions of early timpani with the nakers. Nakers are small kettle drums of the medieval period of Arabic or Saracenic origin. They were used in the West as early as the 14th century and appear to have been introduced by the returning Crusaders after having witnessed their use in battle. On this map, you can see the Crusade routes and how this important cultural transfusion took place from Western Europe to the Arabic region with the Saracens in here. According to Blades, author of one of the leading reference works on percussion instruments, their use in 14th century England became the symbol of aristocracy, used in musical entertainment as an encouragement in the tournament and to increase the sound and turmoil of battle. There is widespread evidence of their use up until around 17th century. Aside from the military implications already mentioned, the nakers were used for dance music and were probably used for accompanying songs, particularly where the song was in a dance rhythm. It is also likely that they were used in processional music in churches, such as the conductus and the ductia. As you can see, the only resemblance between modern timpani and the nakers is that they have a single membrane, are roughly hemispherical in shape, and are usually found in pairs. But being a mere 6 to 10 inches in diameter, the dry sound has only the faintest resemblance to that of the resonant timpani of 26 and 29 inches. The early large timpani, true precursors of the orchestral timpani, began to spread throughout Europe during the 15th century. They were already known in Egypt and Arabia. According to Galpin, the introduction of the larger size, borne on either side of a ridden horse for cavalry purposes, was due to the Hungarians, who, leaving Scythia about the 9th century, brought with them their military customs as well as their national dances and songs. They were introduced into Germany about 1500, as we know from Virdung in his Musiker Getuscht of 1511. He wrote disapprovingly of the big army kettle drums of copper called timpana, which the princes had at court. It is clear that Virdung found little music in these enormous rumbling barrels, which he believed to be the invention of the devil. Pomp and affected elegance were displayed during the performance on these instruments. This reportedly reflected the high rank of the timpanist's court employer. Throughout Europe, the timpani began to take hold as a pompous court instrument, a pair of timpani performing fanfares with 12 trumpets. The pairing of the timpani is clearly a result of their originally being mounted on horseback and camel. Other manners of transporting them were also employed. This is what I refer to as the very first Excedrin headache. Also, carriage-drawn timpani were known in England towards the close of the 17th century. The timpani were used orchestrally as early as 1675 in Lully's opera Tesset. The drums employed were probably very crude indeed, more than likely available cavalry drums or the like. Theoretically, more sophisticated timpani had been in existence since the incomparable Da Vinci. This was his design for a mechanical kettle drum. We have a manuscript from the court of Louis XIV of music composed for 2 pairs of timpani by Philidor, who incidentally was also a great chess master. The usage of timpani in the 18th century orchestra was basically a continuation of that of the 17th century. Fast mechanical tuning had not yet developed, so to change a pitch, each screw had to be individually turned, in this case with a wrench. The timpani were tuned to tonic and dominant, with the tonic traditionally being on the smaller drum. The timpani parts were intimately linked to the trumpet parts. In fact, the timpanist often did not have his own part and had to read from a trumpet part. The timpani were still used as transposing instruments. In most of Bach's 49 compositions that include timpani, they are scored as a C and G in the bass clef, with the actual pitches to be played indicated at the start of the work. in this case, D and A. I'm sure we've all been in a rehearsal somewhere where the timpanist has been playing a C and G when the rest of the orchestra is in the key of D and A, and this is the explanation for it. The question of what 18th century timpani mallets were like is still unresolved. Although there are some extant specimens that are uncovered wood or ivory on the end, these are facsimiles by Ed Harms, there seemed to be some evidence that covered sticks were indeed used, covered either with leather or cloth of some kind. The fact that this was not indicated in the score may be attributed to the nature of the performances of the period. That is, works were often composed for specific occasions, and with the players under the supervision of the composer, so that such matters could be given on-the-spot attention. Towards the middle of the 18th century, some composers began to write works that included multiple timpani setups. This was probably done at the demand of contemporary timpani virtuosi. Johann Melchior Molter, 1695 to 1765, wrote a work for 2 clarini, 2 flutes, viola, cembalo, and 5 timpani, tuned to F, G, A, B flat, and C. And there are other works of this nature. The work I have chosen to represent this genre is the Partita in C major for 6 timpani by Druschetzky. Druschetzky was one of the few virtuoso timpanists identified in the late 18th century. He was born in western Bohemia in 1745 and died in Buda in 1819. Stylistically, the piece is unmistakably characteristic of the period. Contrasting themes, symmetrical phrases, and balanced antecedent-consequent periodic phrase structure are predominant features. The timpani are actually used here to sing a very lyrically melodic line. Ludwig van Beethoven upgraded the use of the timpani in the orchestra, both regarding pitch and rhythm. He cast away the restrictions of writing only in fourths or fifths, now back to the orchestral sense and not the exceptional soloistic writing. And the orchestral timpanist began to acquire new thematic responsibilities, as in the opening of the violin concerto, the duet with the piano soloist in the finale of the Emperor Piano Concerto, and a very powerful voice in the scherzo of the Ninth Symphony. Berlioz was the first major composer to define the type of stick to be used. He felt that the wood and leather-covered sticks that used in most orchestras of the time were too harsh, and the sponge-covered timpani sticks gave to the drum a velvety quality of tone, and moreover, the elasticity of the sponge aided in the rebound of the drumstick. His main objection to earlier composers' timpani writing was that they did not specify the kind of mallet to be used. This is a typically romantic attitude. He felt that he was writing his music not just for the moment or occasion, as was the case in the 18th century, but he was writing it for posterity. The future generations would have to know his intentions by the instructions that formed part of the score. He even indicated sticking, that is, which notes the timpanist should play with his right hand and which with his left. Also typically romantic was his concept of proportion. In his original scoring of the Requiem Mass, he called for 16 pairs of timpani. Economic constraints later forced him to cut back to a mere 16 kettle drums operated by 10 players. Furthermore, among these 10 timpanists, 4 to 6 voices would be played simultaneously. The first half of the 19th century saw a flurry of inventive activity regarding the development of ways to quickly change the pitch of timpani. There were even timpani which used foot pedals that changed the diameter of the head to change the pitch, instead of tensioning and loosening the membrane as we do today. This was accomplished by having a series of concentric internal steel rings of graduated diameters that could be brought up to the head from inside. By slightly varying the tension, all of the semitones in the tessitura could be realized. The mechanism proved to be too expensive to manufacture and was not adopted. By mid-19th century, the proliferation of the different kinds of machine timpani made the process of changing pitches on each drum infinitely faster and easier. Composers began to write for the correct pitches as they changed keys or tonal areas. Up until that point, the timpani either had to be omitted from a distantly related tonal region or forced to play painfully wrong notes. This was, of course, because of the slow and insecure process of changing the pitch by means of hand screws. This was one of those hand screw timpanis. You can see it's very early 19th century. This is another pair from that period, also tuned with a wrench in this case. Now, here we have one of the first kinds of machine timpani. This one is operated by a crank. The player turns the crank, which moves a lever under the timpano, which in turn raises and lowers the spider. This is this piece of metal that connects all of the tuning lugs together. And by raising and lowering the spider, it moves all of the lugs an equal amount simultaneously, thereby changing the pitch at the same time. Here we see some other types. This one had a handle coming out of the side of the timpani, which pulled on cables to change all the lugs. This was a cam-operated crank, also out of the side. And this particular one is one of the first rotary type tuning mechanisms. You turn the entire bowl, and that changes the pitch by means of this screw and, again, a spider. We have today some drums that are popular called rototoms, which are tuned in using the same principle as these. Now, these are very similar to the Dresden drums that I'm playing on right over there. The biggest difference is that they have large lead weights sticking out in front of the pedal. And what that does is it counteracts the tension of the head. The tension is pulling up on the pedal like this, and the weight is pulling down. So the timpanist can change the pitch of the drum with relative ease and little effort. If it didn't have that lead weight, he'd have to push down very hard to be able to tighten the goatskin or calfskin head. So many of the late Romantic works, beginning with Wagner perhaps, show a dramatic increase in complexity both tonally and thematically through the works of Mahler and Strauss and on into the 20th century. Kastner, who wrote a timpani method book in 1845, tells how a Berlin timpanist had recently performed a concerto on 6 or 10, depending on which source you use, drums, running from one to another on a sort of gallery, throwing the sticks in the air, and going through the most extraordinary motions without his execution suffering in the least, all accompanied by 8 trumpets and full orchestra. These flourishes are descended from the mounted horseback military style of timpani playing. The March and Polonaise by Julius Tausch that we will perform for you now is an example of early Romantic stylized music a la Chopin. The 2 parts are very distinct in character, and although the pairing of dance movements goes back to the Renaissance, the slow march and the grandeur of the Polonaise are the quintessence of Romanticism. Berlioz's revolutionary developments marked the beginning of a precipitous evolution of sophistication in timpani writing. Nielsen is credited with writing the first glissando for timpani, and Bartók was the first to realize the full potential of tuning with the pedal timpani. This is an excerpt of the timpani part to the Bartók Concerto for Orchestra, third movement. As you can see, there are no fewer than 8 distinct pitches, and the timpanist must execute this passage on 4 timpani using the pedals. Another change was an expansion in the range of the timpani. Earlier, we had a range from F2 to F3, and by mid-20th century, the range had expanded from C2, that is below 2 ledger lines below the bass clef, up to middle C and beyond. Beginning in the late 50s, manufacturers began experimenting with the marketability of synthetic heads. They were ideal for schools even then, and today they have become so improved that many demanding professionals use them exclusively. The advantages are numerous. Some of the most obvious are that they are unaffected by changes in humidity. The hide heads were notoriously difficult to keep in tune when it began to rain. And even in an air-conditioned hall where the humidity and temperature could be constantly fluctuating as the air conditioner went on and off. Standardization of quality and ease of replacement are other benefits. Today, a standard set of timpani are normally about 32, 29, 26, 23, and 20 inches in diameter, with slight variations according to the manufacturer or units of measurement. The set of Ludwigs in front of me that you'll see I will play the Parris on is such a set. The next series of slides shows a few of the mechanisms currently in use. Now, these are referred to, this is out of Blades, again, as modern hand screw timpani. I don't know what's modern about them, but perhaps they would be useful for pedagogical reasons, but they would be severely deficient for interpretation of the contemporary repertoire for the same reasons that they were in the 19th century. Here we find a modern rotary tune timpano, very similar to the one in the mid-19th century. Crank tune timpani, just like the first one we saw in the mid-19th century. Now these are a little different in that they're much lighter construction than the earlier ones. And they have a slightly different method for holding the pedal in place. These are premier timpani made in England. These are familiar probably to many of you. They were very popular in the high schools 20 years ago or so. Slingerland timpani. Again, they have the spider inside the bowl that pulls on all of the lugs simultaneously. You can see one going in the bowl right there. These are Ludwig Dresden model kind of pedal. And these are pictures of the same timpani I just performed on. Timpani by Gunther Ringer, patent now owned by Ludwig Drum Company. The contemporary timpanist must have an array of timpani mallets of varying degrees of hardness and weights to be able to interpret the vast disparity of styles and sounds that form part of the standard repertoire today. I have a typical set. These are made of cane handles or maple handles, this particular set. They are also, you will find aluminum shafts, different kinds of wood, bamboo, all different materials. The heads, instead of the sponge that Berlioz prescribed, we use piano felt on most of the different hardnesses and styles of the timpani mallet today. We do still use some wooden timpani mallets in special occasions, however, and those are these. The timpani are still undergoing structural modifications due to advances both in high technology and to the entrepreneurial efforts of interested percussionists. Thus, we can find today's high technology intimately linked with an instrument that has changed little in the last 100 years. One percussionist has developed an electronic tuning gauge that counts the vibrations of the head with an infrared sensor and then displays the name of the pitch on an LCD readout. The work that I have chosen as being exemplary of timpani writing in the 20th century is appropriate for several reasons. Taking the form of a concerto, this so-called neoclassical work reaches back to the very beginnings of timpani in Western music. The melodic and harmonic idioms, however, are purely 20th century. By the time this work was composed, dissonance had been thoroughly emancipated. The Paris Concerto uses varying degrees of dissonance contrasted with periods of consonance to help define its formal structure. Harmonic and melodic intervals of minor seconds, minor ninths, major sevenths, and tritones abound. Timpanistically, it exploits the technology of the pedal tuning mechanism almost to the point of obsession, requiring pedal tuning and/or glissandi of all 5 drums at one time or another during the performance. At one point, I'm simultaneously tuning and playing the first and third drums in both parallel and contrary motion. The parallel motion section is curiously reminiscent of parallel organum at the 4th.